So, today I want to talk about infrastructure, Hurricane Ida, and climate change. Hurricane Ida overwhelmed the east coast of the United States. And whether you look at Louisiana and Mississippi, or you look towards Newark, New Jersey, and New York City, the hurricane did massive amounts of damage to communities and lives. Infrastructure got damaged, people died, lives have been uprooted, and pollutants were spilled on both land and sea that will have untold lasting effects. There's so much damage that was done as highways collapsed, rivers overflowed, dams overtopped, tornadoes formed, debris was flying into homes as the roofs of one home would be flung into another, subway tunnels and airports flooded, millions went without power, boil water advisories became the norm and had to be implemented in a lot of different areas and communities, and oil spills occurred in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, I mention all of this not to be a doomer or to say that everything is just the worst thing ever and we can never recover from this, but to remind people that the United States has a massive infrastructure problem, especially as we look towards the effects of climate change. As more and more extreme weather events become increasingly commonplace due to the climate crisis, we're going to need infrastructure that can handle it and deal with it. We're also going to need to start thinking collectively about these decisions, as every home that's more secure, every facility that's made a little bit more safe, every system that's set in place, and every precaution that we take means more and more people will be safe, where we have more infrastructure that's available that is long lasting, and it will mean more people survive these storms and events in the long run with less lasting impact on their lives. We're also going to need to start planning and thinking about 30 years ahead at least, because a lot of these storms, like Hurricane Ida, are just the start of what we're going to experience as the new norm. Things are going to get worse over the next 30 years, and we need to accept that reality and start preparing for it. And that is going to mean creating plans that are going to deal with the storms of 30 years from now and not storms like the ones we're experiencing now. So, I do want to mention as I go through this video that I'm neither an engineer nor a scientist in that regard. So the ideas I'm going to present are all, just ones that I've been able to research and that are known about at this time. They are far from the be all and end all of cutting edge technology, and there are probably even better ideas to implement. But these are just some of the ideas that we could implement if proper funding and resources were allocated for this. The current infrastructure package in the US is far from adequate. And what the US needs is actually a major overhaul in the entire country's infrastructure. Yes, we need to redo water systems and highways and so much more, but we also need to think about how we address different parts of the country as the climate starts to shift. That's going to mean fireproofing homes on the West Coast, and that's going to mean providing a lot of flood care on the East Coast. And so I am going to spend in this conversation a lot of time talking about the issues of flooding and storms. But that doesn't mean that this is, again, the be all and end all of the options available, nor does it address the entire needs of the country, but the areas that will be affected specifically by things like hurricanes. So, more than anything else, what we're going to need to improve upon is the current stormwater systems, how and why we deal with the water that ends up coming from these storms. The current systems clearly cannot handle the amount of rainfall that's being produced in the storms that exist today, let alone the storms that are going to exist 30 years from now. So, stormwater can cause not just flooding, but can eliminate topsoil, it can contaminate water supplies, it can damage the foundations of buildings, it can erode concrete and asphalt, and so much more. And so, these are the type of things we're going to need to think about as we try to improve our infrastructure in the near future. How can we take these areas and improve upon the existing infrastructure as well as develop new infrastructure to be able to handle these issues? The damage caused by stormwater is almost always the most extensive part of storms. Things like what happened in New Jersey, where they had record rainfalls, with Ida flooding the streets in the Newark area and flooding into the airport, is something that's not something that the Northeast is used to dealing with on a mass scale. And while these storms may have been once in maybe a decade, now they are going to probably be once a year and probably increase in frequency over time. So the infrastructure needs to be prepared for it. So, a large part of how we can fix this and start to look towards this is to start increasing the storm drain capacity of major cities. We're going to have to talk about how to expand sewer systems as well as collect stormwater for filtration. If we can take a lot of that water and not just dump it somewhere, but turn it into drinkable clean water before it actually hits the ground and starts absorbing chemicals and everything else, we can improve the condition and lives of people, especially as water becomes more scarce. Other things that I can think of just off the top of my head would include creating garden systems like green roofs that can absorb excess water, as well as using the increased amount of permeable pavers, where you have some sort of road system or even just sidewalks that are created with systems that would allow water to filter into the ground so it doesn't overwhelm the current storm drain systems. And again, those are just ideas off the top of my head. They are things that I was able to research just for the basics for this video. I'm sure engineers could develop much better techniques. In addition to that, one of the other challenges is going to be able to create buildings that are able to sustain themselves through storms. So that's going to mean that people's homes and lives are not at much risk of being destroyed as we create homes that can handle these inclement weather and storms that are going to happen. So, one of the ways that we can do that in order to increase the capacity of a building to handle storms is to actually change the shape that buildings are produced in. Um, that would mean taking these buildings that we have that are largely rectangular or square shaped, and these large, tall buildings that are structured in certain types of ways, and start creating multi sided or rounded buildings. That would end up increasing the amount of aerodynamics of the building, allowing wind to hit the building with a lot less force. And of course, if that happens, and even if something does fall off, it means that it's less likely that the debris will cause as much damage. If you have a building where the impact from the wind ends up shattering it and ends up causing the debris to fly everywhere, it's going to hit other buildings as well. So improving one building with this sort of new system where we change the shape of buildings will increase the safety and care of other buildings in the area and therefore save other people's lives, and also make it easier for rescue workers when they need to come into these places. So the next thing would be to try to improve the building materials that we use on homes. That's going to mean adding insulated concrete into the walls of buildings, or at the very least on the outside of buildings, so that if they are hit with debris, they can sustain themselves that much longer. In addition to that, things like bendable glass and impact shutters rather, are going to prevent windows from shattering during storms and make it a lot safer for people to both be in their homes during less dangerous storms where you don't need to take evacuation procedures. And it's going to make it so that even if there are people not in the area, that a lot of these buildings will sustain themselves and survive longer. Bendable glass is actually a really fantastic thing where they put micro scratches into the glass so that at high winds the glass actually bends slightly and is able to survive without strictly shattering and causing massive amounts of damage. In addition to all of that, we can talk about reinforcing foundations at weak points by adding additional metal or other such materials to the foundations to improve how they can survive. There's systems where you can change the foundation of a building by adding water under it, which will allow for actually causing a small amount of buoyancy to the building. And I'm not exactly sure how that works, but that idea intrigues me greatly. There's also ways that we can waterproof and provide mold inhibitors into the construction of basements and first floor construction. I know a lot of places that have hurricanes regularly already have a lot of this stuff, but this might be something to look towards in the Northeast, especially as they start to deal with larger storms affecting the infrastructure a lot more. That will also involve having flood drainage systems added into buildings that don't currently have them or have inadequate ones, and by adding and retrofitting a lot of homes with newer technologies. And that will all protect if the worst does happen. We have to remember and keep in mind that during a lot of these storms, when mold starts to form, it can get people sick. And if hospitals are shut down or other facilities are shut down and not accessible or available, that is going to mean long lasting impacts on people's health as they breathe in mold and other toxic chemicals that could spill from other parts of the area. And speaking of toxic chemicals in the area, we need to talk a little bit about what happened in the Gulf Coast and what's been happening in Louisiana with their Shell refinery. So we have satellite images that show that there were spills of an oil slick that formed in the Gulf Coast. The powerful hurricane, which swept through one of the nation's largest chemical, petroleum, and natural gas hubs when it made landfall on Sunday, has heightened concerns over the vulnerability of the region's fossil fuel infrastructure to intensifying storms, which are linked to global warming driven by emissions from oil and gas. Now we have here on screen images of the rainbow sheen with the thick, heavy oil and the spill that seems to start under the water. The unfortunate reality is, though, that we don't even know if this is the only source of the leak. And it's going to be an issue cleaning it up as we try to figure out exactly how many sources of leaks there are spilling into this one location. In addition to that, I want to provide a quote from Naomi Yoder, a staff scientist at Healthy Gulf, an environmental group based in New Orleans. They said the spill was the latest sign that pollution unleashed by hurricane was widespread. The corporations that are poisoning our communities must be held accountable and must reverse this catastrophe. There's already tons of pipeline already on the floor from decommissioned pipelines that were built. There's already damage like this oil that's being spilt out there. And in addition, there's this Louisiana Shell factory that basically has been spilling black smoke into the air, the Shell Norco refinery that exists down there. And basically, this facility is spewing black smoke from its stacks. The smell of rotten eggs, the signature scent of sulfur emissions lingered in the air in an effort to burn off toxic chemicals before and after the hurricane. Many industrial facilities sent the gases through smokestacks topped with flares. And this is something that's going to be an issue as these events start to happen more and more often. There's reports that 17 different facilities had to give off a lot of these chemicals. And that's what's going to happen as a lot of this ends up spilling into neighborhoods, polluting the air. And as we know, fossil fuel companies have also damaged the natural storm defense system and just made this that much worse. Some of the oil and gas processed in industrial facilities were pulled from the state's marshlands. To develop wells, companies cut thousands of miles of canals through the wetlands. The canals allow salt water to creep into the root systems of freshwater marsh plants, killing and sinking the wetlands. And what that ultimately does is mean that there's less area for a lot of the stormwater to land on before it hits a lot of major cities and towns. And that's going to have an effect on infrastructure in the future. So, the things that we really need to think about in this is that industrial facilities are really not equipped for storms. And that means there's going to be more runoff and more pollutants coming out of a lot of these facilities. And I don't even know where to start to try to figure out how to contain all of that. But these facilities don't clean up after themselves. And they are never going to clean up after themselves because they're not incentivized to do so under capitalism. They are going to treat it as an externality. It is going to fall on communities. And it's also going to end up affecting climate change even worse. If you have these type of spills that are going to spill into the ocean from these different facilities being hit by storms, it's going to make climate change that much worse. And that, of course, is going to increase the amount of storms and increase the amount of damage that these facilities would need to prepare themselves for while being drastically underprepared. And mind you, chemical runoffs are one of the worst forms of damage that these storms can do. If you have these facilities shoot out all this pollutants, again, you're going to have people breathing in all that toxic air. You're going to see wildlife die. You're going to see water get polluted and end up with all of these chemicals in it. And that's going to make it harder to use that water for other purposes. Even in the ocean, and especially in the ocean, truly, it's going to have devastating effects. The thing is, these ideas already exist. They're already available and they already could be implemented in mass if we really wanted to. And I have no faith in the government to actually do this. If we have any sign from the current infrastructure packages, they have no interest in actually taking it seriously, even with all of the money they're putting into this. If we took something like this defense spending budget and we tried to shift that towards actually taking care of the defensive people in their homes from climate change, we might actually be able to do something about some of these storms. That unfortunately is unlikely to be a possibility in the near future, not because we can't do it, but because we won't do it. If adequate funding and an actual infrastructure program were implemented, we could easily begin the process of making sure infrastructure was established that would ease the damage and burden on people and provide safety nets for people to get proper care when disaster strikes and deal with other economic issues at the exact same time. This includes things like homelessness, healthcare, and you know what? Even other things like trying to deal with climate change itself. Unfortunately, this is not in the interest of the people who have a financial incentive to keep things the way they are and to buy out politicians, and therefore, none of this is likely to happen anytime soon, even though it is quite possible and drastically needs to. So with that said, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my lovely Discord in the description down below. My name is Anarchist Tara, and I thank you so much for watching.